And welcome once again, everybody, to our God is on the Journey to our virtual Lenten series for this year. So thanks very much to everybody for your support and being with us on the journey. And thank you for the feedback, because we know that what we're doing is of a support to you, and that gives us a lot of sense of satisfaction and joy, because we're sharing on the word that nourishes us, inspires us, and challenges us too. As always, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gathered today. For myself and most of our panel here, we're on the Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we look forward to the day when they will find their rightful voice in our community. Just invite Mary Coloe to read our opening prayer today.
Loving God, we have so many desires and hopes in our hearts. Lead us so that we know that our deepest thirst cannot be quenched unless we bring ourselves into the circle of your love. It is there that we find meaning, purpose, and true life. May we learn to drink deeply from the well of love and life that Jesus offers so freely. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mary. So you know our presenters. We're now very familiar to you all, and we're looking forward to this evening. I'll just hand it over now to David for a few words from Garratt Publishing. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chris, and a very warm welcome to everybody tonight, and it's a joy to be with you yet again. Just a couple of things, if I may. This week, I noted very much that Pope Francis last week, or in the last week, highlighted that our faith is a shared experience, for we follow Jesus together. Our Lenten journey is synodal, and since we travel together along the same path, and I'm very grateful that we can share our Lenten journey with hundreds of people online live, and hundreds of people each week on the video as well. So gratitude is a beautiful thing at this time of the year. Indeed, any time. Just quickly, just a couple of ads, if I may. The first one is we have a fantastic virtual book launch for In Her Voice on Thursday. So Mary Coloe is one of the speakers. So if you'd like to grab a cuppa on Thursday night and join us, we'd very much welcome you on Thursday evening at 7:30 via Zoom. And you can register for that event on our website. If you go to our Garratt Publishing website and look for community events, or indeed the email reminder today and the video that we sent on Friday had a link to the registration for that event. So the more the merrier, because it really is a very important book, I think. And, you know, this week, of course, tomorrow is International Women's Day. But, you know, and so we just, you know, had the launch this week. But it's a very important book, I think, for all year round. So that's the first one. And then also next week, we're launching with Frank Brennan his book on the voice to Parliament. So you're welcome to join us next week at 7 o'clock on Thursday, the 6th of March. And again, this week's video will have a link for you to register for that event as well. And I think it's the most important book that we will that you will read this year, given the upcoming referendum, whenever that may be. So I am going to stop my share, and we'll get into the awesomely good stuff from, as you are called now, gurus, on the chat, gurus. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. And just as a little reminder to everybody, if you've got some questions during the evening, please put them in chat, and we'll follow those to make sure that when we come to the conclusion of our presentations, that we'll be able to address your questions. So you're very, very much encouraged to put them there for us. And now, with great pleasure, hand over to Janina, who'll be leading us, as always, and this time into the book of Exodus.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, David. And again, thank you all for being here. So the last 2 weeks in our journey, for the first reading, we have been going through the book of Genesis, or reading from the book of Genesis. And this week, we jump ahead and into the 17th chapter of the book of Exodus. Now, you might know the Exodus story, probably. Let's see where we're up in that. At this point in the Exodus story, the people of Israel have already been freed from the power of Pharaoh. They have left Egypt. They have crossed the Sea of Reeds in chapter 14, and they have now entered the wilderness, where they will remain for the next 40 years. These 40 years is the model, if you want, for Jesus's 40 days in the wilderness after his baptism. Remember week 1, Mary Coloe talked about that. And also for the 40 days of our Lenten observance. So 40, important number. Now, in the wilderness, the people encounter new dangers. Not Pharaoh's army, but they find water that is bitter, that cannot be drunk, that is poisonous. Then lack of food, and then no water at all. Every time God intervenes and solves the problem for this people. So God shows that God is willing and very much able to provide for them. In fact, later on in chapter 19, looking back, God will say, "You have seen how I carried you on eagle's wings. You didn't have to worry about a thing. I carried you." Now, but at this point, we are not quite there yet. So verse 1 in chapter 17, which is not part of the liturgical reading, tells us that the people journey by stages as the Lord commanded. So they do follow God in their day-to-day journey, just like many of us try to do. But now they find themselves without water. In previous incidents have shown that they tend to become a little unruly when there is trouble. In the first instance here, the people start quarreling or arguing or finding fault with Moses, their leader. Their concern and demand are reasonable. Give us water to drink. Something essential for survival. However, if you look at Moses' answer, in Moses' view, and also in God's view, as we will see, they are testing God, not just Moses. That verb test appears a few times in that wilderness story, and also afterwards referring back to it. So the wilderness can be seen as a place of testing. And that goes two ways. It's a place where God tests the people, and it's a place where the people test God or put God to the test. And the former is portrayed or shown as legitimate. God can test the people, but the people putting God to the test is problematic. And in fact, there are two different types of testing. So just give you an example. Just going back one chapter. So we are reading from chapter 17. In chapter 16, God tested the people. God gave them manna to eat when they had no food. But this is framed as a test. God is testing whether the people will actually listen to God's instructions. They are only to collect what they need for the day, not more, except on Fridays where they have to collect the ration also for Saturday, for the Sabbath. So it's like an assessment task intended to teach the people that listening to what God says is good for them, and also they learn about the Sabbath. So the test is ultimately an act of trust, because it's trying out if they can do that, because I think they can do it. Let's try. Ultimately, God believes they can do it. That's why he asked them to do it. The people testing God, on the other hand, in this chapter, is an act of distrust. Firstly, towards Moses, because they complain against Moses in the first instance. But let's see what they say. Why did you bring us out here? Did you bring us here to kill us? So Moses sees that as ultimately doubting God, because Moses knows very well that it is really God who leads them, not he. And also the narrator confirmed that for us. The doubt or the testing of the people is not so much that they doubt whether God can give them water. They are doubting God's good intentions towards them. Why did you bring us out here? To kill us? One commentator and one scholar puts it this way. He says, testing has to do with putting God to the proof. That is, seeking a way in which God can be coerced to show or to act, to show himself or to act. I'm trying to make God do this. And the story reminds us that God cannot be forced to act, because God's help is free grace, given on God's terms and in God's time, and not on command. It's not a vending machine where you push a button and out comes what you want or what you need. However, God does intervene, and that is important. Otherwise, the people would have died. Whether God intervenes because he wants to save the people from dying of thirst, or whether he wants to save Moses from being stoned by them, that's not said, that's not clear. But in any case, God intervenes to save their lives. So God tells Moses to pick up his staff, go to this particular rock. God says, I will be standing there in front of you on that rock. So God is in fact present all through. Strike the rock and water will come out and the people can drink. And then Moses calls the place Massa, testing, and Meribah, quarreling, more or less. The names mean that, but it's a play on those words that occur throughout this text. But what I want to look at is the final question. Finishes in a question. That is a relevant question for us too. Is the Lord among us or not? How do we know that God is with us? With us as individuals personally, or with us as a group or as church? How do we know? As human beings, we have a need for signs, for tangible things, for experience, and that's not the issue. What kind of signs do we need, though? How quickly do we need them or want them? Does God have to perform miracles for us to believe in God's presence? And which ones? And do we remember the times when we did experience God's presence? Really, we can't blame the Israelites for panicking at the prospect of dying of thirst somewhere in the desert. I know I start panicking and quarreling at a much lower level of distress. is the Lord among us or not? So the place of Massa in Reaburn was remembered in biblical tradition as a place of not listening and of not trusting. It's a relationship thing rather than an external problem. So one example where this is picked up is in Psalm 94, and Mary will tell us more about that psalm. Thank you, Mary. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Janina. Yes, I'll call it Psalm 95.
Oh, sorry. I looked at the missal. That was the mistake.
Exactly. In the liturgy, it's often called Psalm 94. In most of the Bible translations now, it's called Psalm 95. There are two different forms of numbering. I've mentioned that before. So this psalm really holds these readings together in lots of ways, or links them in lots of ways. And the first evidence of that is that it actually refers to the event at Reaburn and Massa that Janina has talked about. It actually refers to that both in the responsorial psalm and also, obviously, in the whole psalm. But it's not simply retelling the story. The psalm is addressed to the people, probably in worship context, this particular psalm. And it begins very much as a hymn. It's a joyous calling the people to praising God, which is typical of hymns. And it almost does that twice, two repetitions in different words, but repeating that invitation to praise God. And so it begins that way. So the story in Exodus suggests distrust of Moses and ultimately of God. But in this psalm, it begins as a hymn and it changes to an oracle towards the end, towards the latter part of the psalm. And so we hear God's voice coming in, and God's voice, it's the psalmist, but God's voice making reference to this incident, almost as if you're going to worship me, remember your fragility, because that's what the people are in the desert. They're uncertain. They're uncertain of their relationship with God ultimately, but they're uncertain about what they're going to drink, how they're going to get there, or all of that. So this psalm is in some ways a retelling of the story, turning towards God, turning away from God and turning again to God. And that's in Hebrew, it's teshuvah, it's the whole thing of repentance. It's literally the verb is about turning. But where are you facing? So the psalmist uses that incident as a lesson from the past. So Psalm 95 is quite extraordinary as a psalm. As I said, it begins as a proper hymn in that it's calling the people to praise. It seems very festive, and it has 11 verses, but at verse 8, the tone changes significantly. So the first 7 verses are this invitation to praise, to worship, and the reasons for worshiping God. And they boil down to God as creator, the universalism of God, and God as the one in covenant relationship with the people. So God in the particularity of that relationship as well. So it's quite beautiful in the hymnic element. And then at verse 8, an oracle begins, and an oracle is often used in the prophetic texts, and it's ultimately God's voice, but usually via a prophet. But God speaks, and what we hear in the responsorial psalm, oh, that today you would hear God's voice. And then what becomes the refrain, harden not your hearts. So this is what's happening in this psalm. It's quite a movement that takes place. So the actual responsorial psalm, the first 2 sections are part of that hymnic section, and the third section is the oracle. And it says in that third section, oh, that today you would hear his voice, God's voice. And then we have a reporting, an imaginative reporting, but a reporting of God's voice. Harden not your hearts as at Meribah, at the place of testing, as at the day of Massah, the place of discord in the desert. So, you know, it's remembering that tradition from the book of Exodus. And it's almost inviting the people to learn from it, because if they wish to honour God, to worship God in their lives, they need to remember their frailty, because their ancestors tempted me, God, tested God. They tested me, even though they'd seen my works. They'd been brought out of Egypt. They'd seen God in action, and yet they doubted. And we all do that too. It's not particular to the people of Israel. It's a very human thing. While everything's going well, it's easy to praise God. Then when there's an issue, you know, we doubt God. I heard the other day of someone was telling me their grandson said, "I hate God." And, you know, this grandmother was very, very sad about that, but she was going to hang in there, so that God gets a lot of bad press at times. And the beautiful refrain that we hear each time in the responsorial psalm, if today you hear God's voice, how do you respond? Harden not your hearts. I've got an image there of a hardened heart, a stoned heart. And it's easy to harden our hearts against someone in particular, or against a race or whatever. Conrad Schaefer, who has written a beautiful commentary on the Psalms, he talks here about the anger element, which becomes even stronger in the psalm in the final two verses, which aren't included in the responsorial psalm. But he says anger is a metaphor which expresses God's incompatibility with evil. And I think that's a beautiful insight. You know, when the scriptures talk about God's anger, they're really saying that evil is incompatible with God. And I put there the image from the Ukraine, from the war at the moment. And I think God's saying, in a way, this is incompatible with me. This is not God's wish for us. So I think there are three different motifs that link these readings. And one is the question, how is your heart? And the psalm takes that. So in the Exodus reading, we think about the people's heart, which is turned from God, at least, or is tempted to turn from God. But Moses' heart too, and especially God's heart, because God responds immediately to their thirst. You know, it's quite beautiful there. So just to ponder the different hearts involved. And then the psalm which takes us back to the Exodus reading, harden not your hearts. And in Lent, I think that's a beautiful invitation, not to harden my heart and maybe your heart against anyone or anything, to be open to that. And Romans, the reading from Romans reminds us of the love of God has poured into our hearts. And then in the Gospel from John, it suggests that both the woman's heart and Jesus's heart are changed a little bit in the dialogue, in the encounter. The second image is the rock. In Exodus, the rock, it mentions that it's the rock of Horeb, as well as a particular rock where the water comes out. But Horeb is one of the names for Horeb or Sinai, where the covenant is enacted. So it's the place of the covenant and the place of doubting. So both things there. So the God is the rock, the foundation, the chesed, as we said last week, of the covenant relationship. And then in the responsorial psalm, it says, hail the rock who saves us, you know, and then don't let your heart become a rock. And in Romans, the rock is God in and through Jesus. And maybe in John, the rock is the dialogue itself. And then finally, thirst. For what do you thirst? The people were thirsty in the Exodus story. the whole incident stems from their thirst. And I think Lent says to us, well, what do we thirst for in this season of Lent? And then the responsorial psalm wanting to inspire and celebrate, and yet there's a doubt there. There's a doubt that the oracle voices. And in Romans, thirsting for grace and God's glory, and in John's Gospel, Jesus's thirst leads to the dialogue and the transformation of the woman and Jesus. So some beautiful images there that raise questions for us in this season of Lent. So in Lent, what are we called to? How are we called to worship God? And worship, I remind you, is not just what happens in church on Sunday or church on the weekdays. It's also how we live. Especially in Hebrew, to serve God is to worship God. So how do we want to worship God this Lent? Listening with our hearts to others, to God, actions in search of what will quench your thirst, silence as you contemplate the rock, the anchor of your life, and then I think attention to your heart, my heart, during this season of Lent, to really hear God there. So the psalm makes lots of connections and raises lots of questions for us in this season of Lent. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And Janina, that's some really lovely and rich reflections that we've had so far, and lovely the way that you've linked it together. I was just intrigued when you were talking about the theme of God's wrath or anger, because Pauline scholars would tend to think of God's wrath or anger is actually God's commitment to remove what is of sin, what leads us away from life. So it's not a feeling so much as a commitment to change how we are. So Janina did a lovely job of talking about Exodus 17, the people on the journey, on the road. And so the question is the Lord with us or not? And Paul's answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely, yes. And the reading that we have today this coming Sunday from Romans chapter 5 comes from a really critical part of the letter to the Romans. It's a beautiful reading, and I'll have to share in Mary's lament, as often happens, that we haven't got the full text for this Sunday of the passage that we're looking at. Verses 3 and 4 are omitted, but they're dealing with the Christian hope in the midst of suffering. But that's another story. But we'll come to the text that we have. So just to give you a little bit of a glimpse at what's happening in chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. So it's a structure that we would call chiastic, in the sense that it mentions a theme, comes back to it. So we're justified by faith, verses 1 to 2. Then those sections in verse 2 to verse 5 is about that hope of future glory. Then Paul focuses on very strongly Christ's death and God's love as being part of the one mystery in a very, very powerful way. Is God with us or not? Just look at the cross. This would be Paul's idea there. And that leads to our sense of hope for future salvation. And why should we be hoping? Because we have been reconciled through Christ. So Paul uses a rich number of terms to talk about what happens for us in Jesus. The language of the court, which can be justified, which is the language of being in right relationship, the language of new creation, the language of reconciliation, the language of being rescued. And we see this being acted out in all our readings for this coming Sunday. So this is the question for us in the life of faith, isn't it? That the challenge never to lose hope. And what's been beautifully pointed out already by Janina and Mary is that it was reasonable for the people to lose hope. How would you be out in the middle of nowhere? You haven't got, there's no convenience stores, there's nowhere to go, there's nowhere to hide. You've just got the sun coming down, and you say, we went out of Egypt with hope, but here we are in the middle of nowhere. Who wouldn't lose hope? So one of the things that Paul is reminding us of, and he deals with this in this global picture of faith in Romans, He's got these themes of justification, so being in right relationship, being reconciled, and receiving peace. And don't we always long for that? And we'll see how much the Samaritan woman by the well is absolutely thirsting for being in right relationship and finally being at peace. And we see that relationship developing, and Mary will explore that for us beautifully. So in Paul's language, what's happened in Jesus is that enemies have now become friends. Those who are outsiders have now become insiders. And that's all through God's graciousness. So when you hear language of wrath or anger, just keep on reminding yourselves that any time God has a right to be, if you like, a justification to have that feeling, God does something extraordinary. God removes the obstacle. God opens a new door. This is so much a theme that comes through time and time again through the scriptures. And because of all this, because of God's graciousness, we can look to the future with hope. And our reading for this coming Sunday from Paul from Romans is really laced with hope and reflection with thanksgiving, as Mary was inviting us to in the psalm, for God's graciousness in Jesus and the hope that it brings us. So Michael Gorman has written an enormous amount and a number of books about what's the underlying message, if you like, of Paul's letters, the meta-narrative, and it's about basically God does something extraordinary for us to bring us into right relationship, often called justification. So he provides this working definition. So reconciliation with God in the present. So isn't that something that we all long for? And then that's combined together with a certain hope of salvation. And he uses the language of acquittal, like in a court, or the language of glory. And that's going to be in the future, what we long for, what we journey towards. And what's the basis for this? It's the death of Jesus in the past, but that wasn't the end of the story, because of the gift of the Spirit that continues to be poured into our hearts, and as in Pauline language, as a guarantee of the hope that we have received. Okay, so to come to our text in a little bit more detail. So it starts out like this. So therefore, since we are justified by or from faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So it doesn't make sense if I give you the grammatical language here, but this is an aorist participle which is passive, which means God has been doing the active, not us. This is all about God's activity, not us. So this is all. So that's why you'll hear me ad nauseum talking about it's got nothing to do with merit, ever, in Pauline language. So being justified or brought into a right relationship with God is not something that we do. It's something that is first done first of all for us by God and through Jesus. So the fruit of all that is that beautiful Jewish conception, beautiful concept of being in shalom, being at peace, being as we were created to be, something that we all long for. So one of the things that happened in Pauline scholarship is people are talking, I won't go into the technical language, but are we righteous or are we being treated as righteous? In many ways, Paul's answer would probably say, well, in a sense, it's right and it's wrong to ask these questions, because it's most important to realize that God is in right relationship with us before we're in right relationship with God. So through Jesus' death and resurrection, we are graciously brought into a relationship of peace and reconciled with God. So that's why I've got the image of the law court with the gavel coming down, guilty or innocent. It actually doesn't matter about how we are. It's more God's attitude to us. And the Old Testament is actually filled with that too. It's like going to court when you are certainly guilty and being unexpectedly pardoned and walking out free and saying, how did that happen? That's the kind of feeling that Paul wants to engender in our hearts. This is mysterious, it's gracious, it's unexpected, and it blows our minds and hearts. So God first opens the door and invites us in. So the question then is, how will we respond? So as the text goes on, Paul uses language that talks about how Jesus is our point of access. So Jesus is the one through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And in fact, it's interesting here that Paul uses the perfect tense, which means something that's happened in the past. We have been standing and continue to stand. How? Because of this grace that has given us access to God without fear. And because of that, we can boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. So it's a beautiful language of God, Jesus providing us access to God. It's like Jesus is the one who opens the door and says, come on in. Come on in, when you didn't expect it. So one of the things that's a little bit perhaps disturbing for us in this language is that's language of boasting, because most of our cultures don't see boasting to be a very good thing at all. And one of the distinctions that comes to mind to me is a beautiful distinction that is there in Italian between, and Janina would know it well as well, the difference between superbia, which is like being boastful and proud, and being orgoglioso, which is being like proud of somebody or their contribution, or it's like thankful or rejoicing in it. And I think Paul is actually leading us a lot more to be having this attitude of rejoicing in it and being grateful and amazed by it. It's not about boasting as we would understand it. I hope that's a helpful analogy there. So as I say, it's difficult language for us because we don't want anybody blowing their own trumpet in our world. And in the letter, Paul challenges those who boast of being sure that they will be saved simply because they belong to Israel. And Paul says that's not simply enough. So while Paul wonders at what God has done for us in Jesus, he never loses sight of the fact that we are called to respond. So that's it's not that we merit what God has done, but we're called to respond to it. So you've heard me say this a number of times already. So for Paul, boasting, or could be interpreted as confidence, is based on a grateful acceptance in faith of God's graciousness revealed in Jesus' death for us. So then we come to these beautiful verses of the letter to the Romans, which it's very hard for us to do justice to. But what Paul is trying to say, he's trying to describe grace for us. He's trying to describe what Mary will describe when the Samaritan woman comes thirsting for a drink and she meets the river of living water. So for while we were still weak, at the right time, the katakairon, just at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So there's no point in thinking we merit anything. There's the only boasting, as Paul would say, is boasting in Jesus and what God has done for us in Jesus. And Paul thinks about the experience that we all have. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die, and we actually see instances of that in life. We do actually see that. We know it, it's around us. But Paul is saying, yeah, but God dying for the ungodly? I was reading just in the week, reading some of the materials about Zeus and Jupiter and the Greek and Roman gods. There's no way that they would ever describe anything that comes close to this. Nothing ever, ever, ever. You know, the gods are just larger than us. You know, they have all our frailties just multiplied by being stronger than us. But something like this, unheard of, absolutely unheard of. But God proves or demonstrates God's love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And Paul develops this theme in a number of the letters, and we won't go into it tonight because time won't permit that. But it's a very important element in Paul's thought, what God does for us. So, our readings today start out, is God with us or not? Is the Lord with us or not? Well, Paul would ask us another question. can we be with each other? So Paul doesn't stop with us resting on our laurels and basking in self-satisfaction. God has opened the door, and we are invited to humbly and gratefully enter into a world marked by faith and hope and love. These are the things that endure. And just a little bit from the letter to the Romans itself at the conclusion, may the God of steadfastness and encouragement grant you to live in harmony with one another. So that's our part of the bargain, in accordance with Jesus Christ, so that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father our Lord Jesus Christ. And isn't that what synodality is about these days, inviting us to do that together? I think that's enough for me for now, because I could keep on going and then Mary wouldn't have the opportunity that she so justly deserves.
Thank you, Chris. So the gospel this coming Sunday is from John chapter 4. They do it in bits and pieces in the lectionary. I'm going to be commenting on the whole episode, so you get the way it moves, because there's a logic in how this dialogue develops. Now, frequently, the homily will focus on the woman's morality or lack of. After all, she comes in the middle of the day, not in the usual time when women gather at a well, which is in the morning. And after all, she's got all those husbands. Now, such interpretations are nonsense, and they really miss the point of what John is revealing in this scene. So, another point to make is that when we're reading any passages in the Gospels, we've also got to keep our eye on the Old Testament. What happened back there? Because the Gospel writers, most of whom are Jewish, or they're writing for communities who are Jewish, draw on the Jewish scriptures. So the Gospel begins, and I'm highlighting, notice that Jacob's name is used twice. And then we hear it's a well. It's the well that Jacob, at the land that Jacob gave to his son. Now, and what's more, the woman arrives about noon, the middle of the day. The original audience, the Jewish audience, they would be smiling at this point, anticipating what is going to happen. Because in the Old Testament, wells were always meeting places for a man and a woman, most often leading on to a marriage. And not only that, but the fact that this meeting takes place at noon, that's what happens in the Jacob story. But the shock of this story is that this is a woman of Samaria, and there is immediate hostility. Jesus says, "Give me a drink," and the woman responds, "How is it? You, a Judean, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" This takes us into a little bit of history, that originally under David and then under Solomon, there was only one nation. But after Solomon's death, that one nation divided into two groups. In the north, with its capital in Samaria, known as the Kingdom of Israel, and in the south, capital in Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Judah. And there came a time that the Assyrian nation grew very powerful and swept down and conquered the northern area. And what they did at that time to weaken any sort of rebellion, they took thousands of people from the land and dispersed them in other parts of their nation. And they brought into the land foreigners from other countries they'd conquered. So we get in the northern part, in this area around Samaria, a mixed group, and the people intermarry, and that leads to the people in the south despising the northerners, considering them as half-castes or half-breeds, no longer true Israelites. So when Jesus asks for a drink from a Samaritan, no wonder he gets a hostile reaction. They've had centuries of hostility. But this leads Jesus to shift from talking about real water, this stuff here in my hand, to talking about a different type of water, a living water. Now, the reason Jesus can offer this living water is that already in John 2, Jesus is being described as a temple, the temple. And in the Old Testament or in Jewish theology, the temple rested right above all the waters of creation. So that's why Jesus, the living temple, is able to offer living water. But this is a very clever woman. She's not to be fooled. She says to him, but you've got no bucket. How are you going to get this water? And she's looking at the sort of wells in the Middle East where you did bring your own bucket and your own rope. It's not like a modern well where bucket and rope are provided. Here it's bring your own, BYO, bucket and rope. So no wonder the woman says, sir, you have no bucket, the well is deep. Where do you get the living water from? And then she asks a key question. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well? Are you greater than our father Jacob? Little bit of technical information needed here. This is what the story in Genesis looks like. Jacob went on his journey and he saw a well in the field, and the stone covering the well's mouth was large. And when all the flocks were gathered, the shepherds would roll the stone and water the sheep. But Jacob says to them, behold, it's high day. It's the middle of the day. It's not time for animals to be gathered. Water the sheep, go and pasture them. And they say, we can't until all the flocks are gathered. Then the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. And just then Rachel comes with her sheep. Jacob saw Rachel. Jacob went and rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Great story. Have a look at it. Jacob then goes on and eventually marries Rachel. Now, that's what it looks like, a translation from the Hebrew. But, I should add that this scene, boy meets girl at the local, is a pattern in the Old Testament. It's where Isaac meets his wife. It's Jacob here, and later Moses will meet his wife at a well. So have that expectation. Man, woman, well, there's got to be a wedding in here somewhere. But now that's Hebrew. By the time of Jesus, the people in the land are no longer speaking Hebrew. They are speaking Aramaic. And so the scriptures had to be translated so the people could understand them. And when they were translated, this story of Jacob was elaborated on. It was made bigger, better. I won't say better, but much bigger. So this is what it looks like, right, in the Aramaic version. When our father Jacob raised the stone from above the mouth of the well overflowed and came up to its mouth and was overflowing for 20 years, all the days he dwelt in Haran. Notice, Jacob doesn't need a bucket. In the Aramaic version, Jacob performs 2 miracles. The water rushes up and then it keeps flowing for 20 years. Well, Jesus responds by talking about being able to provide water for eternity life, not just ordinary human life, but to participate in the life of God. That's what eternity life means in John. And the woman changes from hostility, cynicism, to saying, "Sir, give me this water so I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." She's still thinking of physical water. She hasn't shifted. And now the topic changes. And Jesus, because it's a meeting at a well between a man and a woman, naturally it's going to lead to questions about marriage. So Jesus asks her to go and call her husband. And the woman responds, "I've got no husband." And then we find out this woman has had 5 husbands. Now, she could not divorce them. This must have been husbands' deaths, or she's been divorced. But it's not the point of the story anyway. Count the husbands. She's had 5, and she's got 1 now. 6. Now, numbers in the Old Testament and in the Gospels have a symbolic value. For example, the number 7 tends to mean completion. God only needed 7 days before God could say, "It is finished," completed. If 7 means finished, completion, the number 6 always means almost, but not yet. We're close, but not yet. So the question is, where is the 7th husband? And of course, that's Jesus. And remember in Cana, the miracle in chapter 2, Jesus is presented as the bridegroom, the one who can provide all the wine. Now, this is a symbolic passage. We're not talking about Jesus rushing off and marrying the Samaritan woman. We're talking at the symbolic level of a marriage. And in the Old Testament, that was always the relationship between God and Israel. And that's what this passage is really about. The reunification of the northern kingdom, Samaria, and the southern kingdom, Judah. And again, looking to the Old Testament, that's what the prophet Ezekiel talked about. "I will take the people, the Samaritans, and gather them from everywhere, bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, one king. Never again shall they be 2 people. I will make a covenant with them. Never again will they be divided into 2 kingdoms. Then they shall be my people, and I will be their God." So marriage is a great symbol of that. And Ezekiel continues by saying, "And I will set my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place shall be with them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And at the end of this story, it leads to saying that Jesus dwelt in their midst, stayed there. It does lead the woman, though, who perceives Jesus to be a prophet, to ask about, where can we meet God? I see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped here on this mountain. But you Judeans, say the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. And Jesus' response is to say, we meet God not in buildings. It's not a matter of buildings and rituals. It's about the inner spirit. True worshippers will worship in spirit and in truth. With that response, the woman wonders who Jesus is, realizes he's something more, and wonders, I know the Messiah's coming, and when he comes, he'll proclaim everything to us. And then we get this extraordinary revelation. Jesus said to her, I am. And I put it in the Greek there, ego eimi. And that's the name of God. In the Old Testament, Moses wants to know God's name, and God answers, and in the Greek, it's ego eimi, the very name of God. And this revelation is given for the first time in John to a woman. The woman then goes as a great missionary to her village saying, come and see a man who told me everything. And the village goes to him. And then it tells us Jesus, remember Jesus, the living temple? Jesus dwelt with them. Presence of God dwelt with them. When I think about this reading, we've got all of these images. Judah and Samaria, marriage, a divine bridegroom, the coming together of the people, and God dwelling in their midst. So with that as background, where are you? Where am I? And I look at the journey the Samaritan woman takes from hostility, wonder, cynicism, leading her to have faith in her experience. And for me, this journey of faith is a journey we're asked to make. And I think Catholic women particularly need to make this journey. As it was reported on Monday in The Age, Catholic women today are wanting some sort of reform, even radical reform. They know anger, doubt, delusion, disappointment. One woman said, I cling on to the church by my fingernails. But faith is more than buildings or ritual. Faith calls for that inner spirit, integrity and truth. So invite Jesus into your experience now, your emotional experience, the emotional upheavals, and journey with the Samaritan woman who became an agent of change for her community. And I think that's what we're all called to be, women and men who make the journey to be the change we want to happen. I have the ads. So just a reminder. And a reminder too that we couldn't do this if we didn't have the support of David and the whole team of John Garratt. So buy books. Chris's book, Janina's, Mary's, Chris's again, and my book on John. So buy books and contribute if you're able to. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I better stop sharing. There we go.
That's okay. No, you'll share by your presence now. That's great. So that's masterfully done. I think that's really illuminated that text for a lot of people. You know, really, and most people never think about the fact that the woman couldn't divorce herself. So how did she have all these husbands?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. No, terrific, and bring the richness of John there. And as much as I stir you about John, there's a lot of depth and richness there. I know, it's beautiful. So, I open for any questions or reflections, actually, from Mary and Janina in what we've heard ourselves.
Janina, you got a good question. How can we experience the presence of God? And because you asked about,
I asked the question.
Yeah, you asked the question, and Kamal, who's watching, hi Kamal from Pakistan, says, how is this possible? Go for it, Janina.
It is a great question. And as with many great questions, there is no clear-cut answer. And that's why it is a great question. In fact, in one sense, it's a question that runs through the whole Bible. Is God with us, and how do we know? And if you read various stories between the Old and New Testament, you'll find people give different answers, and some are helpful answers and some a bit less. I think it's got a lot to do with what Mary Reaburn said in the Psalm, with paying attention and listen and keeping an open heart, rather than wanting to put God in a box, as it were, you know, saying, okay, the light's on, he's there, good. Because God doesn't tend to do it that way. God is free to act anyway. For me, I've been thinking a little bit, how do I think I know when God is present, or when God is present in something in my life? I think very often it is when, I don't know, I find myself going beyond what I normally would do. All of a sudden there's an extra bit of courage, or I take a decision and I'm not sure, and things happen and it goes well, or there's a peace, or there is the right idea at the right time. Now, these are all things that you can't prove, you can't pinpoint, you can't, nail it down to, now I know. It's something that you know in your heart.
Yes.
So, or maybe sometimes someone else can confirm that to you, or say, you know, that moment, remember that was important.
Yeah.
And that's why I asked the question, do we remember when this happens?
Yeah.
Because that memory is precious.
Yeah.
Can help us other times when we don't feel it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Janina. I'd just like to add the word experience. How do we experience God? And that's not a thought. It's said the.
I think Mary's just frozen.
We'll come back to us, I'm sure.
She'll come back in a second.
I
think too, with knowing God in our lives, often it's hindsight, that when we reflect on something later, we recognize God's action in our life. Then we don't always, or I don't always recognize it immediately, but that's the role of prayer and reflection. Often when I think back on things that have happened, then I say, oh yes, God was present in that.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And Michael Smith asked the question, does Jesus grow through these encounters as we do? And I'll be thinking one of the subtle things in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus hears about the imprisonment of John the Baptist, he withdraws. When he hears about the death of John the Baptist, he withdraws. But in both times he withdraws, and you have this sense of Jesus as having to wrestle as we do. But I think certainly for us as people, as Christians, as people of faith, not just Christians, it's any people of faith, that making space to listen, and I think that's the thing, that deep listening, to say God is in this place. I think oftentimes it's that image of Jacob at the Jabbok having to confront himself and his past, and he wrestles for a blessing. And oftentimes the life of faith is wrestling for a blessing. It's not just in moments of illumination like the Transfiguration as we just had last Sunday. It comes in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it's wrestling, sometimes it's blessing, and I think that's what we see in the Psalms so beautifully represented for us, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we really believe in the incarnation, then we believe that Jesus is fully human, is truly human, as well as divine. But, if we really believe in the incarnation, then that encounter with the woman at the well would have changed him, challenged him, helped him to reflect. So, I don't have any problem with that.
And it's very interesting too when you look at like the episode of Jesus with the Canaanite woman, the Syrophoenician woman, and that she leads him to change his attitude. First he's saying, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but because of her persistence, because of her love, something changes and grows in him. And one of the things I've been working on in doing the friendly guide for the apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels, the lost Gospels to us, we can see that those, particularly infancy narratives, had no problem at all at dealing with Jesus having to grow. Not at all. No problem whatsoever. Even if he was killing other children and then raising them up afterwards and learning to control his anger and so on.
There was an earlier question,
About the
Mary.
translation.
There was an earlier question from Sophie Morley, a very good friend of Garratt, and no doubt why to you as well. I'm interested to know what translation you used for the responsorial psalm, as it is different to the Grail translation in our current lectionary.
I cheated. I used the text from the US Bishops site, and they use the International Committee for English in the Liturgy, that ICEL translation there. So that was the translation I was using tonight. So I did cheat a little bit. I just copied that. But it's true. In Australia, we use the Grail translation. And when I study, I use the NRSV translation. So it's good to look at different translations. It sometimes makes us hear the word a bit differently to what we're used to.
And the other thing that would be true of us is that from time to time we'll just use our own translations anyway, just trying to be faithful to what we see in the text. Yeah.
Not sure whether we picked that one up earlier, Chris. Michael Smith, dear gurus, Jesus' encounter with women on the margins, the hemorrhaging woman, the dogs and the crumbs at the table, the woman at the well, does Jesus grow through these encounters?
Absolutely.
I thought that might be the case.
That's it. I think that because what happens, I think it's important for us to realize that in the light of Jesus' resurrection, then it was natural that early Christians would then, in a sense, be tending to overemphasize Jesus' divinity rather than his humanity. And the early church doesn't have any problem with Jesus growing in understanding. This is not a problem to them, because he really becomes one like us. He pitches his tent with us, and that's the point. So why wouldn't he grow? I think we're the ones, as with the passing of the centuries, that put these other overlays on the text, where the only way we can understand Jesus to be human is with such divine overlays that he knows everything, almost as though Jesus would turn up on our planet at this time and would know automatically how to use a Windows computer. I don't think he'd have any problems with a Mac, but with a Microsoft Windows, that there might be some difficulties. I know, I'm a Mac user, but the idea of Jesus actually learning and being really human. It tends to be like we say Jesus is truly human, truly divine, but that's a way of actually saying these are the goalposts. And actually in our own hearts, where we position Jesus in our own mind and hearts, that's another side, because some of us will probably feel more at home with the humanity of Jesus, others more at home with the divinity of Jesus. But of course, the mystery is to hold it all together.
Yeah. And you can't be fully human without learning and growing.
No.
Funnily enough, as we know.
We allow him to grow physically. We talk about him as the baby Jesus, and then we allow him to grow, so we allow him to grow physically. So why wouldn't we allow him to grow emotionally and intellectually and socially and in all of those ways too? I think it comes down to our belief in the incarnation. I really, we don't take it seriously enough.
No, we don't. In many ways, we don't. Yeah.
I think that's
true. I'm very conscious of time.
Yes.
And the Lord works in mysterious ways. I think we've lost Mary. Coloe, so we might put that down to the NBN or technology, because that can be a blessing and a curse, as many of us would know.
Yes, we know.
some things are sent to try us, I believe, and technology may be one of those.
Well, that's what Exodus was about today, wasn't it? The test.
Indeed.
The testing.
Indeed. I did have some earlier challenges technology-wise earlier today. So.
If the story was today, it wouldn't be about water, but about Wi-Fi or something like that.
Thank you very much, everybody. And just a final note and add, if I may, for this fine tome. We're almost out of them. So if you have been thinking about purchasing a copy, now would be the time to do it, because unfortunately we would have got more printed quickly pre-COVID, but some of the supply chains ain't quite what they were 3 or 4 years ago. So it's difficult to get new copies quickly. So if you want to grab one of the last copies that's in our warehouse, please feel free to order it, and we appreciate your support.
David, I just want to say, someone has asked a question. They said this is the first time they've been able to join the series. And I think on Garratt's website, there is access to the earlier sessions. Yeah, and if Melissa would like to send me an email at david@garrattpublishing.com.au, or just call the team tomorrow morning, we can send you the link. But Melissa, you'll get a recording of the video on Friday from our team. Sometimes you may find a Garratt email goes into the junk folder. Oh, heaven help us. Heaven help us. But sometimes if you don't see those in your main inbox, they sometimes can go in, and we've got the resurrection of Mary by the look of things. So she's back with us after 3 or 4 months. Mary, you're on mute, and we were just wrapping up, but we were missing you.
I suddenly lost the internet connection.
Yep, that's what we thought.
Yep.
Yeah, the Lord works in mysterious ways.
I'm going to complain.
Send him an email.
You'll quarrel and murmur.
Thank you.
Oh, dear me. Well, look, thank you very much. The feedback in the chat is, as always, outstanding. You've really opened many people's minds tonight. So to our wonderful world-class theologians, what you do for us each week is a true gift to us all, and we thank you very much for that. So with that, I bid you a very good night, and I look forward to seeing many of you on Thursday night when you get a little bit more of Mary Coloe in her own voice. So as I said earlier, we're very excited to release that book. I think women's voices have been suppressed far too long, not just in the church, but throughout the community. So that's our little effort to say that's enough, and we need to hear people in her voice. Mary, Reaburn, you look like you were going to... I just want to say happy International Women's Day to all the women who are with us.
That's right.
And to all the men, make sure that the women in your lives have a special day tomorrow. Yes, we do. And I think women's rights are human rights. So let's keep working towards that, because we've still got a long way to go, unfortunately. Good night, everybody. Good night. God bless.
Good night, everyone.
God bless.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.